The last person who knew what I did died on a Tuesday, and when the phone rang, I knew before I answered that the world had finally gone quiet. I sat at the small kitchen table with the vinyl peeling at the corners, my hands folded like they were waiting for permission to move. Outside, the afternoon light leaned against the window, tired and yellow. I listened to the voice on the other end tell me she was gone. Peacefully, they said, as if peace was something you could measure. And I said the right words in the right places. I thanked them. I hung up. I did not cry. I felt something worse than grief. I felt unobserved. For most of my life, I had lived with the comfort of witnesses. Not friends, no, nothing so gentle, but keepers. People who carried the truth like a shared illness. People whose eyes met mine across rooms and said, I know. Even when we pretended otherwise, even when we laughed too loud or argued about weather and money, the truth hummed between us like a wire under skin. It kept me upright. It kept me honest in a crooked way. It kept me from floating away. Now there was no one left to look at me that way. I washed my mug slowly, watching the tea stains spiral down the drain, and tried to remember the last time someone said my name and meant the same woman I had once been. Names can be costumes. I have worn many: wife, mother, widow, aunt, the harmless old lady who knits and forgets where she left her glasses. Each one fit well enough to pass. None of them told the whole story. If I close my eyes, I can still see the day it began. Not the first day of the lie, but the day the truth chose me. It was summer, thick with heat, and I was young enough to believe that wanting something was the same as deserving it. I had stood in a doorway and watched a decision be made without words. The look that passed between them, the certainty, the relief, told me everything before a single sentence reached my ears. I remember thinking, with a strange calm, so this is the shape of it. Some people pray. I listened. After that, life moved quickly, as if afraid I might change my mind. There were papers and promises, whispered agreements over kitchen sinks and in parked cars. There were rules laid out gently, like a blanket over a sleeping child. This is how we will tell it. This is what must never be said. This is what we will all protect. I did not hesitate. That surprises people when they imagine me young. They think I must have fought or begged or collapsed. I did none of those things. I nodded, I learned my lines. I stepped into the life that was offered and closed the door behind me with a soft, final click. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being necessary. Everyone needed me to hold it together, to keep my face steady, to be the one who could swallow the unswallowable. They praised me for my strength, my composure, my reliability. They did not see the cost, or maybe they did and simply decided it was affordable. When you become the hinge on which everything turns, you are never allowed to rust. Years passed like that, decades even. The truth aged differently than I did. It stayed sharp. It stayed awake at night. It tapped me on the shoulder in grocery stores and at graduations and in hospital corridors that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Sometimes it made me laugh at the wrong moment. Sometimes it made me cruel when I should have been kind. Mostly it made me quiet. There were nights when I would sit at the edge of the bed and think of how easy it would be to open my mouth and let it all spill out, like a purse dumped onto a table. I imagined the relief of it, the gasp, the chaos, the way everything would finally have to rearrange itself around what was true. Then I would think of the faces that would change forever, the lives that would tilt, and I would close my mouth again. Silence became my virtue. Silence became my punishment. The others aged too. One by one, the keepers grew smaller, slower, more careful with their words. Sometimes we argued, not about the truth itself, but about the maintenance of it. Who had forgotten which detail? Who had been careless at a family dinner? Who had let their eyes linger too long? We were bound together by a shared crime that was never written down. We were accomplices without handcuffs. When the first one died, I felt a crack of fear. At the funeral, I watched the casket descend and thought, there goes one corner of the net. The second death brought a strange sense of pride. I had outlasted them. The third made me numb. By the time it was down to two of us, then one, I had already begun to practice being alone with it. She was the last. We did not talk often near the end. There was nothing left to negotiate. When we did speak, our conversations were careful, like people walking on ice they know is thinning. Once she said, "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" I told her what I had told myself for years. "There's no other way now." She nodded, and I saw in her eyes the same thing I carried: relief braided with regret, inseparable. After she died, the house felt larger. The room stretched away from me, hollow. I wandered from window to window, touching the backs of chairs, the framed photos with their polite smiles. The story they told was tidy, respectable, almost admirable. If anyone looked close enough, they might notice the gaps. But people rarely look closely at old women. We are background, we are safe. That night, I slept badly. I dreamed of doors opening that had been locked for years, of voices calling my name the way it used to sound before it was weighted with duty. I woke before dawn with my heart pounding and the certainty that something had shifted. The truth was still with me, but it had changed its posture. It was no longer something shared. It had settled into me like a second spine. I made myself breakfast and ate standing up. I thought of all the times I had imagined this moment, and how none of my rehearsed emotions matched what I felt now. There was no triumph in it, no release, only a vast, echoing quiet. To outlive everyone who knew is to win by default, and there is no audience for that kind of victory. As the morning light climbed the walls, I realized something that made my hands shake. For the first time, the truth was mine alone to do with as I pleased. I could take it to the grave and be remembered as exactly what they expected. Or I could speak and tear open a history that had already been sealed and labeled. I poured another cup of tea and watched the steam rise, thin and temporary. I thought about the girl I had been, standing in that doorway, agreeing to something she could not yet measure. I thought about the woman I had become, sturdy and silent, praised for surviving. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a question I had always avoided. What does the truth want from me now? I did not yet know the answer, but I could feel it waiting, patient as it had always been, certain that sooner or later I would have to turn and face it. The truth wanted air. I could feel it in the way my chest tightened whenever I tried to ignore it, the way my thoughts circled the same memories like birds refusing to land. For years I had told myself that keeping silent was an act of mercy, that I was protecting people who had already suffered enough, shielding them from a past that could not be changed. But now, with no one left to contradict me, that explanation felt thin, like paper held up to light. I spent that afternoon opening drawers I hadn't opened in years, not because I expected to find anything, I had been too careful for that, but because my hands needed something to do while my mind unraveled old knots. I found buttons without partners, instruction manuals for appliances long gone, birthday cards signed by people whose voices I could no longer remember. Time leaves behind such gentle evidence of its passing, the truth leaves sharper things. There was a photograph tucked inside a book, slipped there so long ago I'd forgotten the gesture. I recognized the faces instantly. Younger, braver maybe, or just more reckless. I traced the edge of it with my thumb and felt a rush of something like grief, something like anger. We had believed then that we were clever enough to manage consequences, that planning could outsmart fate. I wondered if they had felt proud of themselves in the beginning, or if the weight had come later, the way it did for me, slow, accumulating, impossible to set down without breaking something. In the early years, the truth had felt almost like a shared secret, something dangerous but intimate. There was adrenaline in it, a sense of being bound together by something rare. We spoke in half sentences, raised eyebrows, pauses heavy with meaning. It made ordinary gatherings electric. Even laughter had an edge to it. I mistook that tension for connection. Only later did I understand it for what it was: vigilance. Vigilance ages a person. It teaches you to read rooms too well, to notice the slightest shifts in tone, the smallest inconsistencies. I became excellent at it. I could sense suspicion before it was spoken, curiosity before it turned into questions. I learned how to redirect conversations, how to smile just enough, how to feign confusion or forgetfulness when needed. People called it wisdom. They said I had good instincts. They did not know how literal that was. There were moments, though, small, dangerous cracks, when the truth threatened to surface on its own. A child asking the wrong question. A relative noticing a resemblance they couldn't place. A drunk confession cut short by sudden clarity. Each time my heart would hammer so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Each time, we patched the story again, smoothing over wrinkles, adding explanations like extra layers of paint. The original shape disappeared beneath our revisions, but I always knew it was still there. I carried guilt differently than the others. They had roles that allowed distance, authority, certainty, denial. I had proximity. I was the one who answered late-night phone calls, who sat at bedsides, who listened to fears spoken in whispers. I absorbed the consequences in ways that never showed on the surface. If there is such a thing as moral interest, I paid it monthly, faithfully, without complaint. There was love in it too, and that is what complicates everything. Real love, not the kind people write about, but the stubborn, inconvenient kind that grows despite circumstances. It made the lie feel justified, even noble, for a long time. When you love someone enough, you can convince yourself that the truth is a cruelty they don't deserve. I told myself that over and over until the words felt like a prayer. As I grew older, people began to underestimate me. It was a relief. The truth likes underestimation. It thrives in spaces where no one is looking closely. I leaned into the role, softened my voice, let my hands tremble just a bit more than necessary. I allowed myself to be dismissed. There is power in being overlooked, though it comes with its own quiet humiliation. Still, it made the guarding easier. Now, sitting alone with my tea gone cold, I realized how much of my identity had been built around that guarding. Without it, who was I? A woman with a long life and a tidy narrative. A survivor, they would say. They always say that, as if survival is the highest form of virtue. They do not ask what you survived by doing, or what parts of yourself you buried to make it through. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my face. The lines told stories of weather and worry, laughter and loss. None of them told the whole truth. I wondered if it was visible anyway, if someone with the right eyes could see it crouched behind my gaze, patient and unrepentant. I wondered if I had ever truly forgiven myself, or if I had simply outlasted my accusers. The idea of speaking out began to feel less like a threat and more like a question. Not should I, but to whom? How? Why now? I thought about the damage it might still do, the lives it could unsettle even after all this time. I thought about the comfort of silence, how familiar it was, how it wrapped around me like an old coat. And then I thought about the weight I had been carrying alone, and how heavy it felt without anyone else to acknowledge it. That night, I took out a notebook and wrote a single sentence. It was not a confession. It was not even complete. It was just a beginning, a line that said, "This is what really happened." My hand shook as I closed the cover. I did not know if I would ever write another word. But the act itself felt like breathing after holding it in too long. I placed the notebook back in the drawer, not hidden, not displayed, just there. The truth I was learning does not always demand to be shouted. Sometimes it waits to see if you are finally ready to hear yourself say it. I went to bed with a strange calm settling over me. For the first time since the phone call, sleep came without dreams. In the quiet before I drifted off, I understood something with a clarity that startled me. Outliving everyone who knew the truth had not freed me from it. It had only changed the question. The secret was no longer how to keep it. The secret now was whether I would let it end with me. The next morning, I woke to the soft hum of the world outside my window. The birds were at it again, calling and fluttering about like everything was as it always had been. It's strange the way the world moves on, even when you feel like you're caught in a standstill. I wanted to feel light, to take in the sunshine and breathe in deep like some people do after a long winter. But the air around me was thick with a question I wasn't ready to answer. The notebook sat in its place, still unopened, as if it were waiting for permission. It had been easy to write that one line, easy to admit to myself that I had finally acknowledged the truth I'd carried for so long. But something about the idea of continuing, of unraveling the whole thing, made the walls of my house feel smaller. The weight felt heavier. I wasn't sure anymore if it was the truth I was afraid of, or the loneliness that would follow once it was set free. I thought of the faces I had avoided, friends who had disappeared after the years grew long, family I'd kept distant, not because I didn't love them, but because loving them would mean letting them see the things I had buried. When we love, we tell ourselves it's a form of protection. And maybe it is, until it isn't. Maybe the true harm is in the silence we keep, pretending that we are saving others, when really we are only saving ourselves from the consequences of our actions. The guilt, I had come to understand, had never been about the lie itself. The guilt was about the secret, the deliberate act of withholding, of choosing silence over truth. That was the thing that kept me up at night, that gnawed at the back of my thoughts. In keeping the secret, I had hidden parts of myself away too, trapped in a version of me that was only as real as the stories I told. I sat down at the kitchen table again. The mug in front of me was cracked at the rim now, an old thing I'd never bothered to replace. My hands lingered over it, feeling the rough edge of its imperfection. I had a strange urge to break it further, to just shatter it and let the pieces fall into the sink, to destroy the past and let it go, all at once. But instead, I set it down with care and wiped away the tiny flecks of dust that had settled there. What would it take to undo all those years? To open the door that had been locked for so long? I thought about the people who had left, the ones I had lost touch with or who had passed away, and I realized how much of my life had been lived in the shadow of something I could never erase. But there was no getting around it now. I could keep the truth locked up with me, or I could finally let it breathe. There was a knock on the door, so soft that it almost didn't reach my ears. I got up slowly, already knowing who it was before I even opened it. Of course, it was Margaret. She had been my neighbor for years, a woman who spoke in whispers and always seemed to know more than anyone else. She had seen the passing of time in this house, seen the changes in me, and, I suppose, in her own quiet way, had always known I was carrying something I wouldn't share. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as she always did. There was no judgment in her eyes, only curiosity and an unspoken understanding. Margaret had been the closest thing to a confidant I had ever allowed myself, though I had never told her everything. Not even close. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice low, as though she was testing the waters. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It was strange, having someone stand there, someone who had known me for so long, who had seen the layers of me that I had hidden beneath other masks. She sat down at the table across from me, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "You've carried it alone for so long," she continued, her gaze never leaving mine. "I suppose I've always known there was something unspoken between us." There it was again. The acknowledgement. The truth, spoken without words. It was almost a relief, in some strange way, that she could see it. It was as if I wasn't the only one carrying the weight anymore. "I never meant to keep it from you," I finally said, my voice quieter than I had expected. "I know," Margaret replied, her tone soft but firm. "We all have our reasons, but I can't help but wonder. Are you ready to let it go now? The truth?" The question hung in the air between us, a delicate thing that felt as though it could break at any moment. There were no promises in her words, just a quiet challenge. I didn't answer her immediately. I thought of the notebook, still sitting in the drawer, and the words I had written there. What would happen if I let it all spill out? Would I finally feel like I could breathe? Like I could put the past to rest and move on? Or would the consequences be more than I could bear? Margaret leaned back in her chair, sensing the weight of my thoughts. "You don't have to do it for anyone else, you know. You don't have to share the truth just because someone is asking you to. You can do it for yourself, for the person you've spent all these years hiding behind the silence." Her words struck me with such force that I felt my heart flutter in my chest. She was right. I had spent so much time living for others, for the ones who would never know the truth, for the ones who would be shocked or hurt or angry. But I had never asked myself what it would mean for me, for the woman who had lived her life carrying this weight. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. "I think it's time," I said, more to myself than to Margaret. "I think it's time I let the truth breathe." Margaret didn't move, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. There were no more questions from her, no more expectations. She had given me the space I needed to find my own answer, and now there was nothing left but the quiet path ahead. The truth would come out, whether I was ready or not. But maybe, just maybe, the hardest part was already over. As I walked toward the drawer, I felt something inside me shift. I wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but for the first time in a long while, I felt the edges of the truth, sharp but clear, no longer a burden, but a part of me. And perhaps that was enough. I opened the drawer with a steadiness I didn't know I had left. The notebook was still there, nestled between old bills and forgotten receipts, waiting. I pulled it out, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was thin, almost fragile, as if it knew its time was coming. I opened it slowly, letting the pages fall open to where I had stopped. Just that one line, the beginning of everything I had kept hidden. The pen had left a faint imprint on the paper, the words still raw, but the page remained empty beyond that one confession. I thought about Margaret's words, her challenge, and a quiet determination settled in my chest. I could do this. I could finally put it to rest, not for anyone else, but for me, for the woman who had lived in the shadow of her own silence for far too long. I took a deep breath and began to write. It wasn't supposed to be this way. None of it was. I thought that if I kept it hidden, if I protected the ones I loved by burying the truth, it would somehow make things better. But in the end, it only made me a prisoner of my own life. The words came easily, faster than I had expected. It felt almost like I was speaking aloud, each sentence tumbling over the other, too urgent to be contained. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to second guess. I just wrote, letting the memories spill out in their rawest form, without the layers of protection I had so carefully built over the years. I remember the night we decided. It was raining, and the world outside was so quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the choice. The hardest choice I ever made. We were sitting in the living room, you and I, staring at the clock as it ticked away, knowing that once that hour passed, there would be no going back. I paused, my pen hovering above the page. That night, I had spent years pretending it hadn't happened, pretending that the decision hadn't altered everything. But the truth was, it had changed us all. Changed me most of all. I told myself it was for the best, that it was the only way, and I made sure the others believed it too. No one questioned it, no one but me. In the dark corners of my mind, I questioned everything, but I held it in. Because if I didn't, everything would fall apart. Everything. The pen trembled in my hand, but I didn't stop. I had never allowed myself to acknowledge the weight of that moment before, the moment when I had buried the truth so deep, I couldn't remember where it ended, or where I began. As the words continued to fill the pages, I felt a strange release, like the pressure of years finally being allowed to escape. I wasn't sure what would happen after I finished, or what would come of the confession I was making, but in this moment, as the ink spread across the paper, I was free, at least for now. I paused again, but this time, I didn't feel the need to pick up the pen immediately. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle around me. The air felt lighter, almost thinner, and for the first time in so many years, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. But that peace was fragile. I knew it would only last as long as the truth remained unspoken, and I couldn't keep it to myself forever. What would I do when someone found out? When someone asked questions I couldn't answer? When the lies and half-truths I had clung to for so long were finally exposed? Could I live with that? Could I live with the fallout? I opened my eyes and looked at the notebook again. I had written it all, every detail, every feeling I had buried. And still there was more to tell. The more I wrote, the more the truth unraveled, until it felt like there was nothing left of me but the raw honesty of my own mistakes. I closed the notebook and set it down gently on the table, the weight of it still heavy in my hands. It felt almost sacred, this thing I had created. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. The doorbell rang again, this time louder, more insistent. I glanced at the clock, surprised to see how much time had passed. Margaret was still there, I realized, waiting patiently, as she always did. I stood, my legs shaky but determined, and walked toward the door. As I opened it, Margaret was there, her face soft but knowing. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't need to say anything more. The question was enough. I nodded. I didn't know what would happen when I told the full truth, but I had to. For myself. For the woman I had spent so many years hiding from. I'm ready, I said, my voice steadier than I had expected. It's time. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally standing in the light. Margaret gave me a small, knowing smile. It was as though she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. And now that it was here, she didn't need to ask any more questions. She just stepped inside, making herself comfortable in the living room, settling into one of the worn chairs I had grown so used to over the years. There was something about the way she moved, the way she sat, that suggested this was no ordinary visit. She had come here for more than just casual conversation. She had come to witness something I had long kept hidden. For a moment, I stood there, unsure of how to begin. The truth felt both too heavy to carry and too light to ignore, like something between my ribs, pressing on me from all sides. I had already written it out, every detail, every memory, but telling it aloud felt different. There was no eraser in this conversation. There were no second chances. I knew this was it. The moment when silence would finally lose its grip on me. I found myself walking toward the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of it comforting as I poured us both a cup of tea, the steam rising in quiet wisps. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She simply waited, as she always had, patient and unwavering. She wasn't rushing me, which made me feel a strange mix of relief and discomfort. This was my story to tell, and it had to come from me. I handed her the mug and sat down across from her, the table now feeling smaller, as if the space between us had shifted. I could feel my pulse quicken, the weight of everything pressing against my chest. My hands, which had once been so steady, trembled now. But still, I didn't look away. Margaret's gaze was gentle, expectant, but not demanding. She was giving me space to breathe. The words that had been locked in my throat for so long now seemed to tumble out of me, as though they had been waiting for their moment. It wasn't just one decision, I began, my voice rough, betraying the years of quiet suffering. It was a series of them, one choice after another, each one leading me deeper into a place I couldn't escape. I thought I was protecting everyone, but in doing so, I lost myself. I lost the truth, and I lost the chance to ever be free of it. Margaret didn't interrupt. She just listened, nodding slightly, as if she understood. I wasn't sure if she did, but I needed her to hear this, to know the full extent of what I had carried. I had spent so many years hiding it from everyone, especially myself. But now that I was speaking it, it felt different than I had imagined. It wasn't just a confession, it was a reckoning. I remember the first time I lied to him, I continued, my voice growing stronger, though still laced with emotion. I told him everything would be fine. I told him I would always be there, that nothing would change, but I knew it would. I knew it was already changing, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop the lies from multiplying, from weaving themselves into every corner of our lives. I paused, the silence between us stretching, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Margaret seemed to understand that I needed time. She waited until I was ready to continue. The hardest part was convincing myself it was all okay. Convincing myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself over and over that I was saving everyone from the truth, from the chaos it would cause. I didn't realize that the real chaos was in me, in holding it all in, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. And the longer I held on to it, the harder it became to let go. I could see the weight of my words settling into the space between us, but there was no judgment in Margaret's eyes, only understanding. The truth was a slippery thing, I realized. Once it was out in the open, it didn't sit still. It moved, it shifted, and it made you question everything you thought you knew. I thought I could carry it forever, I whispered, more to myself than to Margaret. But I was wrong. Margaret set her tea down on the table and leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but filled with quiet conviction. You've carried it longer than most could ever bear. You did what you thought was best at the time, but you don't have to carry it anymore. You don't have to keep living in that place of guilt and silence. You've done your part. Now it's time for you to live for yourself. Her words hung in the air like a lifeline. I hadn't expected this, hadn't realized how much I had been longing for it. Someone to tell me that it was okay to stop carrying the weight, to put it down and breathe. I don't know what will happen after this, I said. a sudden fear creeping into my voice. Once it's out, there's no taking it back. People will find out. There will be consequences. Margaret nodded, her expression soft but knowing. There will be consequences, yes, but there are consequences to every choice we make. You've spent so many years living with the weight of the truth. What would it be like to live without it? The question stung more than I expected. What would it be like? Could I even imagine a life without this constant shadow, this constant fear that someone would uncover the secret I had buried so deep? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing. I was tired. Tired of running from it. Tired of pretending it didn't matter. I think I'm ready, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm ready to let it go. Margaret's smile was small but full of understanding. Then it's time to set yourself free. I stood up, the feeling of resolution settling over me like a blanket. It wasn't a complete freedom. It wasn't as simple as just speaking the truth and watching everything fall into place. But it was a beginning, a first step toward something new. I walked over to the table and picked up the notebook. I stared down at the pages, at the words I had written, and I felt a sense of finality. The truth was no longer just a secret I carried alone. It was something I had shared, something I had acknowledged. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was hiding anymore. I felt like I was standing in the light, ready to face whatever came next. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. I knew that, but I had already taken the hardest step. I had faced the truth, and in doing so, I had faced myself. And now, there was nothing left to hide. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back in the drawer, not to lock it away, but to leave it behind. The truth had already been spoken. Now it was time to let it go, to let it breathe. And maybe, just maybe, I would finally learn how to live without the weight of it. The days after I spoke those words felt oddly muted, like the world had slowed down to give me time to adjust. I went about my routine, moving through each moment as if I were walking in a dream. But there was no denying the change inside me. I had said the truth aloud, finally, and something in the air between me and the world felt different. It was as if a door had been opened, and the space I'd once filled with silence now had room to breathe. Margaret continued to visit, though her presence was less about offering comfort and more about letting me find my way. I had always known she could see through me, but now I didn't mind. It was as though she had been waiting for me to make the first move, to stop hiding from what had been so carefully buried. We sat together one afternoon in my living room, both of us sipping tea, the room warmed by the late afternoon sunlight that filtered through the curtains. The house felt emptier somehow, quieter in a way I hadn't expected. When I thought back to the years I had spent pretending, to the mask I wore for others, I couldn't help but wonder how I had stood the weight of it for so long. Margaret glanced at me over her cup. How does it feel now that you've let it go? I looked at her, my hands wrapped around my mug, the warmth seeping into my bones. It feels strange, like I'm stepping into a new life, but there's this emptiness too, like something's missing. She nodded, understanding. That emptiness is the space the truth was filling. It's a good thing, really. You'll learn how to fill it with something else. I nodded, though the thought felt unsettling. What would I fill it with? For so long, my life had revolved around the burden of keeping secrets, around making sure others never discovered the truth. And now, with the truth out in the open, I felt lost, like I was standing on the edge of a vast, empty space, unsure of what to do next. It wasn't just about the people I had kept the secret from, the ones who would be affected if they ever knew. It was about me, about the person I had become in the process of hiding. Who was I without the burden of that secret? Who was I when I was no longer bound by the weight of the lie? The question haunted me more than I liked to admit. But as the days passed, I found myself slowly reclaiming pieces of the life I had buried beneath my guilt. I started to laugh again, not out of obligation, but because it felt good. I found joy in the small moments, watching the way the light shifted across the kitchen floor, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face during my morning walks. These simple things, so easily overlooked before, now seemed like gifts. The air smelled fresher, the world seemed more open. But there were moments, small, fleeting, when the old weight returned. It wasn't the secret itself that haunted me, but the absence of it. The emptiness, the silence that stretched between me and the people I had spent so many years protecting from the truth. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees filled the quiet space around me. My thoughts drifted back to the others, the people who had never known, the ones I had shielded from the truth with the excuse of love and protection. What would they think now? Would they see me as weak for finally speaking, or would they understand why I had kept it buried for so long? I could feel the weight of their absence more sharply now, even though they were still here, still alive in their own lives, continuing without me. I thought of the friends I had kept at arm's length, the family members I had distanced myself from. I thought of all the times I had smiled and nodded when I should have said something real, all the moments I had played a part rather than living it. And I thought of the people I had lost, the ones who had passed away, leaving behind only memories and regrets. Could I ever explain it to them? Would they have understood? Or would they have carried the same weight that I had, living in silence, holding on to secrets, never knowing what it was to speak the truth? The question felt unresolved, hanging in the air. I stood up from the garden bench and walked back inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet almost comforting. I returned to the table where Margaret had left a pile of old family albums we'd been looking through over the past few weeks. She had brought them over one day, asking if I wanted to revisit the past, to look at the faces that had once filled my life. I hadn't wanted to at first, afraid of what it might stir up. But now, for some reason, it seemed the right thing to do. I sat down and flipped open the first album, the pages yellowed with age. There, staring back at me, were the faces I had once known so well. The smiles, the laughter, the moments frozen in time. And among them, I saw the faces of the people I had kept the secret from, the ones I had tried so hard to protect. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to remember without guilt, without regret. I let myself see them as they had been, flawed, human, imperfect. They weren't figures to be admired or protected. They were people, just like me, carrying their own truths and their own burdens. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. The truth isn't just about what we hide, it's about how we choose to live with what we've revealed. It's about accepting the consequences, good or bad, and finding a way to move forward despite them. I closed the album, the weight of the past lifting just a little more. I wasn't sure what would happen next, or if the people I had kept at arm's length would ever come back into my life. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid to face what came next. I had let the truth out. Now, I had to live with it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. Something I had never allowed myself to imagine. Something I had avoided for years, even in my moments of self-reflection. It was the hardest part, the one I hadn't been ready to confront, even after everything I had gone through. The truth I had shared, the silence I had broken, that was only one side of the coin. There was still the question of forgiveness. I had spent so long protecting others, ensuring they never saw the truth, that I had forgotten the importance of forgiving myself. The guilt that I carried for so many years, it had become so much a part of me that I had mistaken it for a kind of moral currency. I had convinced myself that by holding on to it, I was paying for my mistakes, balancing the scales of some unseen debt. But in truth, all I had done was imprison myself, unwilling to accept that the past was already gone, and that I could never undo what had been done. Margaret had left earlier that day, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I wandered through the house, glancing at the old photographs, the quiet spaces where memories used to sit like dusty relics. I wondered how much I had changed. I wondered if I had truly accepted the past, or if I was still living in the shadows of it, unable to fully let go. I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection, the lines on my face more pronounced now. I had lived with a secret for so long that I had become a version of myself I barely recognized. Was I still the same woman who had made those choices? Or had I become someone else entirely? Someone who was free, finally, of the burden that had shaped so much of my life. It was then that I understood. Forgiveness wasn't just about other people. It was about me, too. I had been holding on to my own version of the truth, not just to protect others, but to shield myself from the very act of forgiveness. I had to forgive myself for the choices I made, for the silence I kept, and for the years I had lost to shame. And so, in that quiet room, staring at my reflection, I finally allowed myself to say it. I forgive you. I said it out loud softly at first, as if testing the words. And then, more firmly, I forgive you. It wasn't a magical moment. It didn't erase the past. But in that simple act, I felt something shift. The weight, the suffocating silence, began to lift just a little more. For the first time in years, I felt like I was free to be myself, without the shadows of old guilt following me around. There was no grand revelation after that. No sweeping conclusion or grandiose resolution. Just a quiet understanding that the truth was now part of me, yes, but it no longer had to define me. I could live with it, carry it, and still move forward. I could take the steps toward forgiveness, not just of others, but of myself. And in doing so, I would finally allow myself to live the rest of my days not as someone who had hidden a truth, but as someone who had finally embraced it. As I stood there, feeling the cool air from the open window brush across my face, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. The truth had been spoken. The silence had been broken. And for the first time in a long while, I could hear the world around me clearly, without the weight of the past pressing on my chest. The future was still uncertain, and that was okay. I didn't need to know what would happen tomorrow. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to control everything. I was free to live in the present, to make the choices that felt right, and to stop fearing the things I couldn't change. It was enough. And with that, I knew I had come to the end of this chapter. A chapter of hiding. A chapter of silence. And though the pages had been painful to turn, I had finally closed it. And in doing so, I had made room for a new story to unfold. The end, and yet, in many ways, the beginning.